So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the power of planning ahead. We've recently retitled this presentation to be called Streamlining Your Legacy, Organizing Essential Information for Your Executor. But it's the same idea. In this chat, we'll talk about protecting your executor and family from undue stress and added tasks rather, by empowering them and supporting them now by having your affairs and having affairs not only in order, but organized in a way that's going to help take proper steps for executors when they need to take them. So this is our standard presentation, but I have been asked by Frédéric and have the honor to be tailoring it slightly to this community. So you'll see that in just a little bit, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. Specifically ask how we can adapt the presentation to include strategies on dealing with those with cognitive impairments. And while I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a medical professional and can't comment on those aspects, what I can comment on is my personal experiences from those who are grieving, and I'll get a bit about myself here in a second. But because I believe that there are many overlaps between those who are grieving and those who have cognitive impairments. Again, not a psychologist or whatnot, but I think there are strategies that can be applied in both situations. So I'm going to try and do that. Be talking about that. So, my name is Jason Swan. I am with the Pre-Need Funeral Group with Arbormemorial. I am a licensed funeral director. So I have been with families and met families and sat across from families on some of the worst days of their lives. I'm also a pre-planner now, and I have the honor of helping to plan ahead to make sure that life's most challenging days run a little bit smoother and easier. And I'm also a celebrant and a theater guy too, I guess. I'm very comfortable speaking in front of large groups, and celebrant just meaning that I've led and created non-denominational celebrations of life. And I'm here today to talk to you about pre-planning and education, which involves, whatever metaphor you want to use, many spokes to the planning wheel or pieces to the planning puzzle. Insert your metaphor of choice here. So I'm going to touch on a few topics, but if you have any specific questions throughout or afterwards, I am going to have my email and contact and my cell at the end. So write down questions as they come up throughout. Feel free. There's going to be a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to try and be mindful of time. But if we do run out of time or if I don't get to your question, email me, call me, we'll chat. I'd be honored to help out. I did send out a survey just if anyone did have any questions, didn't get anything back. So I was going to tailor towards that. But so I'll talk for probably about half an hour. And then if you have any questions from there, we can do a little Q&A. Yeah, we'll go from there. So what I educate the public on and what I have the honor of doing, not just in pre-planning, but in through these educational chats and seminars, I educate on the following. So all things funeral. So I think we all know what a funeral is, but funeral services just aren't about the ceremony. It's much larger. There's so many logistics that go into even the most simple of services. So if you plug this now, if you haven't let your funeral wishes be known to your executor or your family, they're going to be left wondering, no matter what they do, if they did the right thing by you or if you did the right thing by them, if you're the executor, because it was never let known what the wishes were. My grandfather expressed his wishes to quote put me in a box and put me in the ground, which a lot of older gentlemen that I meet with, they express very similar wishes, but we did end up having and going a little bit against his wishes, having what we thought was going to be a small graveside service and ended up being attended by over 150 people. There's a need to grieve and to feel, and oftentimes we're well intentioned in trying to keep it simple, no muss, no fuss. But oftentimes, again, in my experience, I that can lead to some maybe unexpressed grief and maybe a feeling of being stuck in your emotions because they haven't had an outlet to go. Again, I mentioned again, not a grief counselor. I'm not many things, but I'm really good at what I do. But again, if you haven't given thought to what you want, or you do know what you want, but your wishes aren't recorded anywhere, we can certainly help by giving you the tools you need to help record your wishes. So whether you have a formal funeral at a church or a more informal celebration of life isn't as important as answering this incredibly important and, well, say, challenging question. How am I going to help my family grieve? So I'm going to pause here because this is the standard presentation. Something I'm going to say verbally here, tailoring it to the grieving. So what kind of strategies do I use in order to tailor to the grieving? Some people who are impaired by tragedy, we'll say. So I have 6 suggestions, and I've got a little cheat sheet. If you, again, it's not part of the standard presentation, but please, if you want to email me, I'm not going to ask you to like a mailing list or anything like that. But I've got a cheat sheet here. If you want to email me with it, you just want it. I'm going to say this as well. I believe this is also recorded and will be available to replay afterwards. But so just some strategies that we have here. Get everything in writing, number one. So sometimes contracts can be very detailed in the funeral industry, and that's a good practice everywhere, but especially with the grieving, because you may forget things, including that you actually signed a contract with a funeral home, which has happened. We did have an individual, and this was Humber College is one of the places you go to get your funeral director's license. And one of the stories that's drilled into our heads was about a gentleman who recently lost his wife and called a funeral home, made all the arrangements, signed all the documents, went home, and then his neighbor found him and said, "Hey, what's up? Oh, my wife just passed. Oh my goodness. I know this funeral home. I've had really good experiences with them. You should go there." And he said, "Oh, okay." And went to a second funeral home, signed a second funeral contract, and then the first funeral home called and said, "Hey, are you coming for the visitation?" And he said, "Who are you?" So we want to make sure that everything is in writing first off, but that's just to underlie the importance that when we are dealing with the grieving, we want to make sure that we're taking nothing for granted, and so we get everything into writing. And as a follow-up to that, the first I believe it was the first funeral home just said, no, don't worry about it. We're full. The industry is full of a lot of very compassionate people, and so my understanding was that they just said, we're just going to cancel this contract. You go with the other funeral home. Um, yeah. Number two, simple language, clear and straightforward. We try to avoid jargon and complex explanations. Give it to me straight, as they say. Number three, we have quiet spaces. So the funeral home tends to be quiet, and our arrangement offices are deliberately put away from visitation suites so that we aren't interrupted or distracted. But especially when you're on a limited capacity, even some of the smallest noises or distractions can be very distracting, and are amplified in those spaces. Number four, we try not to be alone with individuals who are grieving. We try to have someone else in the room with the grieving, not just for like the second brain that can be in the room to help remember some things, but can also be there for support, but also ensuring what gets said gets remembered. Like we're not transcribing conversations, but what do they say? That we remember about half of any meeting we leave right away. We'll amplify that for the grieving. Um, so it's good to have someone there as support, as a witness, and also as an advocate, right? Someone who's going to be who might know you a little bit better than the funeral home to say, actually, this sounds this sounds off. Like, are you sure this is what you want? And just to question some things and be there and be a good advocate and in your corner for when you're not maybe there to be present 100%. Number five, I use pictures. So visuals are amazing. People may not remember what you said, but they tend to remember what they saw. And when showing a family into, say, a selection room, one of my things that I do is I actually physically touch the item they're looking at, not just assuming that we're looking at the same thing. I physically go up and I touch. I'm like, this is the one. Yes, okay. And the same thing if I'm in a family home. I'll point to a picture on the page that I have in the catalog because down the road we may not offer that, and I'll also put that in the file for the future funeral director to have them compare that too. But it has happened where someone has, assumed that they had selected, it was an urn actually, so they had assumed that they had selected one urn years ago, and on paper it was a different thing, but they had assumed it was the same thing. So when I showed them, this is from my experience, I showed them the urn and said, "This is the urn you selected," and they said, "No, that wasn't it." So I always try to use visuals or some kind of like evoke another sense, right? Whatever that may be. If there's, we try to use sometimes, we use like a calming sense, right? Um, so just something to get people in a better frame of mind and to help ensure that everything is very clear. And number six, repetition, repetition, repetition. So we repeat key information, we provide a summary of the meeting after, and just keep repeating to make sure that we fully understand. So those are some things that I do for to help tailor as a funeral director to the grieving. And again, it may make sense to apply these to those with cognitive impairments. So I hope that some of those strategies are able to be transposed onto those with cognitive impairments as well, who aren't grieving. Um, so that's funeral side, and that's kind of like my pause to say here's kind of how we tailor that. Um, the other thing we pre-plan and or help with pre-planning and education is around cemetery. One of my colleagues got a call from this is unfortunate, but it was a thrift store manager who found a discarded urn with cremated remains inside in their donate bin. And they could only postulate that the urn was kept at home for decades because they had no place to put it, rather than pay for a cemetery plot, however many years later, they decided to throw out the urn. And that's just as a funeral director, just I just no, I don't like that. Again, we're we're well intentioned in keeping the urn at home, but 15, 20 years later, what does that look like? Right. And I'm not saying we're all going to be found in thrift stores one day, but it does highlight the importance of having a plan for your remains. And that's what we help with as well. I say there's so many options with cemetery today. I even have a hard time keeping up with what's out there. There's niches and urn burials, nature walks, benches, mausoleums, and each have their own little advantages. So whether you have cemetery property or not, or whether it's your intention to get cemetery property or not, the more important question to ask is, what is your plan for your remains? So with funeral, what are you doing to help your family grieve? Cemetery, what are you doing to help plan for, what are you doing with your remains? Travel protection is another thing we educate on. So what happens if you are traveling to Arizona and you suddenly pass away? Well, if you're traveling on your own, will your family have to travel there to coordinate everything? Will they need to pay for airfare out of pocket? If cremation is your choice, is the cremation happening there? Are we flying the body back home? What is the plan? And my role is to help you answer that question. How can I protect my family from undue stress if I die away from home? Estate protection is something we also do. This is basically all about fraud prevention. And there are three basic parts to this that we help with. So credit bureau notifications, so Equifax and TransUnion, notifying them so that if, God forbid, someone gets access to the social insurance number and tries to build fraudulent credit with it, which unfortunately does happen, it gets flagged and shut down. One thing newspapers are doing now is that if a family is calling the newspaper on their own and not the funeral home, the newspaper is now required to call the funeral home to verify that indeed the person has passed because of the risk of fake obituaries being posted and sent to insurance companies to receive a death benefit on someone who is still alive. I know. Just but those are things that happen, unfortunately. So these are the things we try to prevent. The other thing we do is we notify the social insurance number itself. That actually happens automatically when a death gets registered in one of the Canadian provinces, not the territories, but in the provinces. But that does take up to a year to have on record to cancel that number because of the speed of bureaucracy, and maybe even longer now with the Canada Post strike. um, but yeah, so that's why we notify the credit bureaus right away, is because there is that time frame of about a year, 6 to 9 months, but up to a year where there is not that protection in place. So that's why we put that protection in place. And the final thing we do is we can help families cancel credit cards, right? So if you have a credit card in your name, again, the big thing to remember, primary cancel secondary. So if you are the secondary on an account, secondary card on an account, and we cancel the primary, that's going to cancel the secondary. So it's just always a good thing to remember. Estate organizing. So this is having ideally a place where all of your information is together, ideally in one place. All of your important documents in one place, everything is just together, or at least well documented if it's not in one place where you can find this, so that all your executor needs to do is to pick it up and start from the beginning. I like to say the more you do now to prepare and organize, the easier it's going to be for the grieving. Don't add grief to the grieving by not being organized. Wills and powers of attorney. Now, I am not a lawyer, again, but another thing I'm not. But I say, as a funeral director, I do take direction from the executor of a will first and foremost. As a funeral pre-planner, I'm not able to have any conversation with any other person still living to discuss a file review without a power of attorney for property. And in both cases, in a will and a power of attorney document, you're basically asking someone to speak on your behalf and or make decisions on your behalf. A power of attorney dictates who your voice will be while you're still alive, but maybe incapacitated. And a will dictates who will be your voice the minute you pass away. And by the way, in case you didn't know, power of attorney ceases at the moment of death. So power of attorney no longer becomes applicable. Then we look to see who is the executor on the will. So if you have a power of attorney but no will, then that could be complicated. So when we talk about planning, we ask some questions. Who is your power of attorney and your executor? Do they know that? That's important to know. You'd think that's a basic question, but there are people who become executors, and I had no idea I was in the will. And sometimes wills can change, and sometimes so we want to make sure that everyone is in the loop. It's always best practice. Um, so it's just, who are these people, and do they know that they are? And further to that, if you ask someone to be your executor or your power of attorney, maybe give them a heads up as to what that includes as well. That's probably a best practice to say, hey, would you be my executor? Here's everything that I anticipate you would have to deal with, as opposed to, hey, would you be my executor? Yes or no. So it's always best to have informed consent when we're talking about something that can be a full-time job for someone. either through power of attorney or through wills. So again, everyone can sleep a little bit better with full disclosure. The other thing we do, assisting with the paperwork after the funeral. So ahead of time, we have a document called the 87 decisions document, which is part of our planning paperwork. Decisions that should be taken often in the hours after a death has occurred. But we also have an aftercare service that we will sit down with the executor and go through a 200-item checklist over the course of about an hour, just to say exactly, outlining exactly what needs to happen and putting everything into perspective for them. And where they need to go, what's left to do. So the question is, do you want your family to deal with the paperwork and tasks, or would you prefer the funeral home to help out and keep your executor organized? And then finally, emergency funds. So this is something to think about. So do you have emergency funds set aside while the estate closes? So I'm not talking about funeral or cemetery funds, because in an ideal world, those are already paid for. But even then, maybe the family now wants to add on a reception but you weren't sure, so you left that off the pre-arrangement contract. But that aside, we're talking about, if say a house is going to be sold and the estate is going to go through probate, well, sometimes housing sales can take a few weeks, so sometimes months before everything goes through. And sometimes it can take weeks before a bank will release funds because they are waiting to have the will probated to know that they're releasing funds to the right person. So household expenses don't stop. So if you're asking, say, your kids to be your executors and they have a house of their own and bills of their own, now, now you're asking to add another full house's expenses onto their shoulders temporarily, mind you. But can they withstand those expenses while the estate gets probated and while we get for those the official letters and funds can be released? So that's something to think about as well that not a lot of people do think about having. So it's certainly something to keep more front of mind. So that's kind of what we help you navigate. And I know that's just kind of touching very, very general and 10,000 feet conversations about it. Um, but again, the role in this community education seminar is to explain what needs to happen. There's a few more slides here, so I'll go through those because this is all what we talk about. So when we ask all of these questions, right? So to summarize again with the funeral, how am I helping my family grieve? What is what with cemetery? What are the plans for my remains? Three, what happens if I pass away outside of the city or outside of home? Um, the how can I protect my family from fraud? And so when we talk about that, we talk about the estate protection. How do I make it as easy as possible for them? So that's the estate organizing. How do I have people in place to make sure that my wishes are upheld both now and when I pass? Who's going to be doing the paperwork for the funeral afterwards? So things like the government pensions, and I'll go through those in just in a couple of seconds in more detail. But and then do I have emergency funds set aside while the estate closes, or for any other unforeseen events that might pop up? So those are questions that you might want to start asking if you haven't started asking them already, or if this is for someone else and you are the executor. This is also a kindness to have these conversations with the person for whom you are the executor, if it's possible, obviously, um, because this is going to be a kindness to your future self, shall we say. And so when we talk about solutions, when we talk about the question, they're very simple, very straightforward, and I'm pretty sure we might know exactly what they do. It's like, how do you lose weight? Well, you eat less, you eat better, and you exercise, and maybe you sleep better. We all know. kind of what to do. But it's actually doing it. That's the thing. So if I were to offer, say, a plan, course of action, the solution. So complete a power of attorney for property as your money first. Complete a power of attorney for personal care. Complete a will, and I'll talk the three kinds of wills here in a second. Have some money readily available, or have everything in a joint account, right? That is one strategy. Again, not a financial planner, but if you want to talk to your bank or financial planner about the advantages and disadvantages of having a joint account, then that would be certainly worthwhile. Complete and pay for prearranged funeral planning so that your executor is not paying out of pocket for that, or it's not coming out of your estate. And same thing with cemetery. So that's not coming out of your estate either. And so let's talk about wills just for a second. Again, very, very broad overview. There are three ways you can create a will in Ontario. The first is you can have it prepared by an estate lawyer, someone who specializes in creating wills, which if you have any kind of complications with an estate or your estate isn't, pretty straightforward, always the recommended way to go. Prepared from a kit. So we have, a legal will kit if things are pretty simple, just to let your basic wishes be known. We also have partnered with willful.co, willful.co. And that's an online will. I actually have one from Willful myself. All I did, I went on and I answered just like a few basic questions about what I anticipate, who my next of kin is, all of that, and it generated a will for me. It was amazing. So like that's something, if you don't want to go to a lawyer for whatever reason, then that's the next step. Be to go to a kit. Or you can do a handwritten, aka a holographic will. So if you handwrite your wishes and have it witnessed, you can look into different options on how that looks and what the legalities are behind that. Again, not attorney, but we might be able to recommend based on your needs what you're looking for. Again, if there's any kind of complications, we usually recommend just go see a lawyer, because it's going to be, even though I know lawyers can be expensive, it can be even more expensive down the road if things go sideways with the estate. And that can lead to delays as well. So we're not talking just about expenses financially, but time, like a huge time expense, which is one of the most valuable resources we have, is time. So how are we saving money and time for executors? And one of the best ways, again, just have a will in place if you don't already. When we talk about powers of attorney, we go into two parts. Again, I think we touched on this briefly before, but who's going to deal with your money and who's going to deal with your health? So when we talk about power of attorney, again, these are your voices to make all of these decisions on your behalf, should you not be able to. And so I think there's probably a few people here who maybe on the call who are power of attorneys for their loved ones. If you are, then kudos, and that's a huge responsibility and a huge undertaking and an honor. Can be. I know it can be sometimes meaningful and sometimes challenging, but it's a huge, I have to give kudos to anyone who's a power of attorney. I have a lot of respect. So if you are, kudos to you. Again, lots of respect. So when we talk about after the funeral's over, we're talking about putting things in place. We've talked about, the wills, powers of attorney. When we talk about now getting something in place for a funeral, what happens, what happens with if there's nothing in place and the funeral's over, what's next? There could be a lot of confusing paperwork for the executor. We have to do the Canada Pension Plan benefit if they paid into CPP over their life. And we say 2 applications. So if there's a surviving spouse, there's a second application for the survivor's benefit. And then the CPP death benefit, which is the one-time lump sum payment of, presently it's $2,500. Death certificates, who gets one, legal identification, cancellation, passports, birth certificates, company pension plan, life insurance claim form, lots more to worry about. I'm going to kind of zoom in. I'm mindful of the time here, so I do want to allow time for questions. But that's all to say that after the funeral, we do have service called aftercare, where we complete all the forms for you, help with provide identity theft restoration, contact Equifax TransUnion. We will contact employers' benefits departments, help with insurance claim form, provide ongoing support to the executor as well. So it's not just, we don't just meet with a family and say, okay, we hope to see you later than sooner. Ha ha ha. We actually do provide ongoing support so that if you have a question a couple months down the road, we still want to be a resource to you. We also do provide the journey home. So that is if we're, if you passed away in Arizona, what happens? Well, we have a specific plan to put in place to repatriate remains. Again, there's a one-time fee, protects the executors, is good for as long as you live. It covers airfare, cargo, embassy fees in some countries, bribes. It covers everything that we need to do in order to get remains home. And companion expenses are also covered. So if we need to travel down to be present and with for the body, say in Arizona, then companion expenses are also covered. So things that we do offer. So if you're not convinced yet, advantages of pre-planning. So why should you discuss planning in general? And not just funeral, by the way, like everything. It is easier for your family. It is easier for your executor. Again, the more you do now, the less work your executor is going to have to do while they're probably grieving your loss. It eliminates emotional overspending. I had that this week, unfortunately, where we're not supposed to sway one way or the other, but we hear the thought process of the family saying, "Well, mom, uh, really, she was there for us. There was nothing in place, so like we want to do what's best, and so we're gonna upgrade the casket. We're gonna spend more on flowers. We're gonna have a big, catering." And meanwhile, if mom was still here, mom would be like, just you don't want to say rolling over in the grave in these presentations, but it's just but I don't think mom would agree with that necessarily. And so by having something in place, you eliminate emotional overspending. And just in general, it provides peace of mind. So you just say, it's all done, it's all taken care of. And so they can go, okay. And in my experience, if you're talking to children about your final wishes, it's good to include them. It's good to let them be informed. Most kids, in my experience, when the parents come back to me to pre-plan, they say, "Well, we talked to the kids," and I'm like, "Did they just say, yeah, okay, yeah, pretty much?" So that's it's usually like because kids aren't going to necessarily always argue with their parents in the later stages about their final wishes. So it's just okay, that's what you want, and that's what we're going to make happen. But it's not what, it's that, right? So it's not what you have in place, it's that you have something in place. So when we talk about, and I'm just very briefly on this part, historically, if you do sign a pre-arrangement contract, the funeral home goods and services, those prices get locked in. So if we take, say, an average cost of $9,500 today, 15 years later, it's still going to be $9,500 because there's not going to be any, price increases. So the difference here that, between 95 and 17, that's money that can now be used for the estate. That's money that can be donated to charity. That's more money that can be gone to beneficiaries, children. So that's just something that's just to note on that. So when we have that visual there, I just wanted to show that. This is really the big thing I wanted to say, and briefly, we far common trends of our family. So in order throughout our life, how do we go through planning? First, we do our financial planning. So we get some money, we store it away, it gains interest. We have our ESPs and tax-free savings account. We accrue and amass our funds to set aside with the intention that those funds and the interest from those funds will help to pay for our retirement. Right, and also tax preparation and tax minimization to help make sure that you pay the least amount of taxes as possible, and the most amount of money can go towards you and your beneficiaries and whoever you want it to go to. So number one, we do financial planning. And then once we've got the funds in place, well, we want some way to, because we need some way to distribute them, and we need some way to manage them. So legal will, right? So the will is, your executor is responsible for distributing the estate according to your wishes. Power of attorney is responsible for health and finance, especially for property, is responsible for your funds, while you are still alive. And so when we have these funds and now we protect them, distribute them, manage them, and then we talk about cemetery and then we talk about funeral. And most people will stop at number two. And so this is the order one, two, and then if they want, they get their cemetery in place. They begin with the end in mind, shall we say. And then once the cemetery is in place, then they'll talk about funeral, travel protection, final document service. But a lot of people will stop here at two, and they don't even get to three, and they don't even get to four. And so it's when a death occurs, what's the order? Well, it's in reverse. So the first thing we have to do is number four. One, two, three, four during life, four, three, two, one in death. Four, we need to take care of the funeral if the death has occurred overseas, bringing the body back home. Final document service, all the government paperwork, we need to do that. And then, we have the funeral, we have the cemetery. And then once the dust has settled, then we go, okay, well, let's do a reading of the will, and then let's distribute the money. So, and deal with, the final taxes, death and taxes, as they say. So one, two, three, four in life, four, three, two, one in death. So the question is, why wouldn't we do three and four, get all of this in place? Because this is a when, not an if. So why wouldn't we get at least the funeral, travel protection, final document service, all of that in place? Because your executors, your family, that is going to be step one for them. And it's going to be, if there's nothing in place, one of the hardest steps to do. And I know, speaking from personal experience, it is, and I'll point all 10 fingers at myself as well. It is challenging to have these conversations. There is a correlation, again, in my experience, between how challenging a conversation is and how meaningful it is. So the more that we engage with these items here, and then we go to here, the easier it's going to be on everyone down the road. These are all acts of, not to get too sappy, but like acts of love and acts of kindness and caring for those left behind. Because ultimately, again, this is going to be the first thing they do, even though it's the last thing we want to talk about. So how are we putting that plan into place if we don't have something already? So all of this today is just to help you get some ideas around what's important to think about in planning ahead, because again, this is going to be a when, not an if. So I hope that this helps, get everything into place. So how do we help at the funeral home? We help you plan. So everyone who is registered today can receive a free planning kit from us. So I'm going to put my email up in the next slide, and email me. We'll sit down together. What I am asking though is, if you are asking for a planning kit, I'm going to be sitting down with you to actually go through this plan with you. And the reason being is because I've given kits to so many people, and then I follow up in a couple of months and, oh, yeah, no, we really haven't gotten around to it yet. But if you have someone in the room with you just to go through things and actually do it, then it's done. And then it's done. That's one of my mottos, of my own personal mottos of pre-planning. And then it's done. So please email me, but only email me if you don't just say, I want the information, but I want to make sure you're doing something with that information. So I would certainly be honored to sit down with all of you who are here today and who watch, down the road on the recording. By all means, reach out to me. I will put my email in the next slide here and take some questions. But if you are emailing me for a kit, just know we're going to be sitting down together, and that's just to help you become more accountable to the plan as well. So I want to thank you very, very much for all of your time today. My cell phone and my email are right there. I'll leave it up here. So Arbormemorial is a family-owned, Canadian-operated funeral and cemetery home provider. Um, they are located throughout Canada. It is a Canadian company, and it is a family owned. So it is a privately owned Canadian only company. It is the only large funeral company that is strictly Canadian. So that's really nice. So in Ottawa, Arbormemorial owns the six Kelly Funeral Homes. So I work out of right now Kelly Funeral Homes in Orleans, Walkley, and Somerset. But I work out of any funeral home, really. I go where I'm needed to help do pre-planning and get plans in place. I come to homes, I meet in the funeral home wherever. I just meet you where you are to do whatever we need to do to get a plan in place. Um, so Kelly's, again, was owned by Mr. Lauren Kelly until I believe 2006. He sold to Arbormemorial. Arbormemorial also owns the Capitol Funeral Home and Cemetery out in Manotick. And so Arbor has a cemetery, crematorium, and six funeral homes plus an on-site funeral home at the cemetery. So that's a bit about Arbormemorial and how it presents in Ottawa. Um, yeah, so that's about it. We've been around since I believe the 50s. And Kelly Funeral Homes just celebrated its 70th anniversary as well of being established.